We're in Nahum chapter 3. Nahum chapter 3 is made up of 3 taunt songs, and each of these taunt songs contains a rhetorical question emphasizing the certainty of Nineveh's judgment. And these rhetorical questions are contained in verse 7, verse 8, and verse 19. So the question in verse 7 is, where can I find anyone to comfort you? The question in verse 8 is, are you better than Thebes? And the question in verse 19 is, for who has not experienced your constant cruelty? So what we're going to do is we're going to spend one study on each of these taunt songs. So the first taunt song is Nahum chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. And Jerome has said that no translation can do justice to the beauty of the Hebrew language in verse 1 through 4. But we're going to do the best we can. And so to start out, I'm going to read this taunt song. So the first 7 verses of Nahum chapter 3. Woe to the city of blood, totally deceitful, full of plunder, never without prey. The crack of the whip and rumble of the wheel, galloping horse and jolting chariot, charging horsemen, flashing sword, shining spear, heaps of slain, mounds of corpses, dead bodies without end, they stumble over their dead. Because of the continual prostitution of the prostitute, the attractive mistress of sorcery, who sells nations and clans like merchandise by her prostitution and sorcery. I am against you. This is the declaration of Yahweh of armies. I will lift your skirts over your face and display your nakedness to nations, your shame to kingdoms. I will throw filth on you and treat you with contempt. I will make a spectacle of you. Then all who see you will recoil from you, saying, Nineveh is devastated. Who will show sympathy to her? Where can I find anyone to comfort you? So verse 1 begins, Woe to the city of blood, totally deceitful, full of plunder, never without prey. And Actmeyer says here, quote, the fact this is a woe oracle is indispensable to its interpretation. Prophetic woes were pronounced over those who were doomed by God. This is an oracle directed against false security, against those nations and individuals who think they can preserve and save themselves in the onslaughts and sea changes of human history. Those who would save their lives shall lose them because they are relying on their own powers and not the powers of God, end quote. So the woe, while in certain contexts is the cry of mourners in a funeral procession, that isn't the intention in this context. Instead of a woe of lamentation, this woe serves as an announcement of certain doom. And Christensen here says, quote, prophetic oracles were far removed from that context of mourning and grief. Instead, they took the form of invective and were pronounced as curses on those doomed by God for destruction. The use of that form here indicates that Nineveh's demise is certain, as if the city were already dead and on its way to final burial. The literary form of the woe oracle is normally in 2 sections. An accusation that states the evil perpetrated and an announcement of the punishment to be meted out as judgment, end quote. And we will see both sections of the literary woe oracle contained in verses 1 through 7. The accusation is in verses 1 through 4, and the punishment is detailed in verses 5 through 7. So the first part of the accusation against Nineveh is that Nineveh is called the city of blood. And blood is in the plural, so it would literally read the city of bloods. And scholars point out that when blood is in the plural in the Hebrew, it denotes shed blood. That when blood is inside, being spoken of inside the body, it's in the singular, but when it's shed blood, it's in the plural. And that's what we have here. Again, it's in the plural in the accusation against Nineveh. And this is why some translations render the phrase city of bloodshed. And Christensen here says, quote, the ruthlessness of ancient Assyria is legendary. The cruelties perpetuated by that regime are shocking. Captive heads of state were shut up in cages as spectacles for the populace to see. The heads of those already executed were hung around the necks of those still living, and others were flayed alive. some scholars have concluded that the Assyrians were the most ruthless people of antiquity, and reference to the blood shed by the Assyrians calls for revenge on the part of the god of vengeance, end quote. And this brings to mind the Old Testament concept of the avenger of blood. And the avenger of blood, according to the Jewish Encyclopedia, is the clansman, the next of kin, or the kinsman redeemer, upon whom devolved the duties of avenging on the person of the murderer the blood of a murdered kinsman, and of redeeming the property or the person of a relative that had fallen into debt. And the kinsman redeemer is the main theme of the book of Ruth, in which Boaz, who is a type of the Messiah in Ruth, Boaz is the kinsman redeemer. He redeems the property of Naomi and the person of Ruth. Now, there's no bloodshed to be avenged in the book of Ruth, but we do see Boaz fulfill the second part of the requirements of the kinsman redeemer, or the avenger of blood there. And Yahweh is the avenger of blood, the kinsman redeemer for his people. He fulfills both roles. And we see both of these roles laid out in Deuteronomy 32, verse 43. And I'm going to read that out of the ESV, because the ESV is one of the few modern translations that translates the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint into its running text, into the reading. And the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint of Deuteronomy 32:43 are quite a bit different from the Masoretic. So Deuteronomy 32:43 says, "Rejoice with him, O heavens, bow down to him, all gods, for he avenges the blood of his children and takes vengeance on his adversaries. He repays those who hate him and cleanses his people's land." So there we see Yahweh fulfilling both roles. He avenges the blood of his children, and he cleanses their land. And this reminds us of what we read in Nahum chapter 1, verse 2, which says, "Yahweh is a jealous and avenging God. Yahweh is avenging and wrathful. Yahweh takes vengeance on his adversaries and keeps wrath for his enemies." God is also cast as the avenger of blood in the book of Revelation. For example, Revelation 19, verse 1 and 2 says, "Salvation and glory and power belong to our God, for his judgments are true and just. For he has judged the great prostitute who corrupted the earth with her immorality, and has avenged on her the blood of his servants." So the last part there is what we're going for there. He avenged on her the blood of his servants. And we will be in and out of the book of Revelation a few times today, as Nineveh and Mystery Babylon are linked once again through the language of Nahum chapter 3. And somewhere between probably about 75 or so, give or take, years after Nahum, Ezekiel was prophesying in exile in Babylon, and Ezekiel calls Jerusalem the city of blood 3 times. So it's possible that Ezekiel was inspired by Nahum's phrase and was indicating that Jerusalem had become like Nineveh. And like Nineveh, Jerusalem was also destroyed by the Babylonians. So the second part of the accusation against Nineveh is that of deception. And some scholars suggest the phrase "totally deceitful" can also be translated as perfected deceit, that the Ninevites, the Assyrians, had perfected the art of deception. And the net renders the literal Hebrew as, quote, "all of her is lying," end quote. So Assyria had perfected deceit both externally towards the nations they dealt with by issuing vain promises of help and protection, and also internally with domestic propaganda directed at their own citizens. And Christensen says here, quote, "If politics is the heart of lying, Assyria developed that art to a high degree," end quote. And scholars point to Assyria's dealings with Israel and Judah as detailed in the books of Kings and Chronicles as examples of Assyrian deception. So I'm not going to read those passages, but if you guys are interested, if you're all interested, you can go and read those. They specifically link to when the Rabshakeh came and spoke to Hezekiah, is the example that they point to. And accusation 3 is that Nineveh is full of plunder. The plunder is once again a reference back to the boasting of the Assyrian kings, as we've seen throughout our study of Nahum, and it's going to continue to come up as well in this particular taunt song, that Nahum references the quotes of the Assyrian kings as evidence of what they've done, and the judgment that's pronounced is pronounced accordingly. So Ashurbanipal boasted that his entire territory was filled to its farthest border by the plunder. And accusation 4 is that Nineveh preyed upon or victimized others. And the idea of prey is a reference back to the lion imagery that we discussed at length in chapter 2. So we see shedding blood, lying, profiteering, and victimizing make up the first list of sins. And the persistence and magnitude of the sins is emphasized. The words totally, full, or never without were used. So the community is saturated with sin. And if you remember the Lord's reason for sending Jonah to Nineveh in the first place, in Jonah chapter 1 verse 2, the Lord said, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness is come up before me." So 100 plus years before Nahum, the wickedness of Nineveh had risen to heaven, and Jonah was sent, and Nineveh repented at the preaching of Jonah. But there's no such repentance in the days of Nahum. Their wickedness had reached heaven once more, and now it's time for judgment. And Robertson here says, quote, "It hurts to watch people being slowly crushed by a system calculated to squeeze the last breath from the defenseless." End quote. So verse 2 and 3. "The crack of the whip and rumble of the wheel, galloping horse and jolting chariot, charging horsemen, flashing sword, shining spear, heaps of slain, mounds of corpses, dead bodies without end, they stumble over their dead." And these verses are structurally similar to the Song of Deborah in Judges 5:26 through 28. Specifically, that's the section in Judges 5 in which the death of Sisera by the hand of Jael is described. And Spronk here says, quote, "The reference to the frightening noise of the wheels coincides with the fact that in the period of Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal, the rims of the large wheels of war chariots were studded with nail heads." End quote. And the descriptions here are delivered in such a way so as to place Nahum directly in the middle of the military onslaught and its bloody aftermath. It's as though Nahum is standing there on the field as these chariots are rushing past him, and then he's also standing there in the midst of the aftermath, the carnage with the dead bodies all around. And Nahum's descriptions of the piles of the dead is very reminiscent of a line from the Codex of Hammurabi, which says, quote, "May she," and in this he's speaking about Ishtar, to Ishtar. So it's, "May Ishtar strike down his warriors, water the earth with their blood. May she throw up a heap of his warriors' dead bodies on the plain." And also another quote from Ashurbanipal is relevant here, where he's quoted one of the texts as saying, "Over an area 3 double hours in length, I filled the plain with their corpses." So Ackmeyer and others, including Jerome and Bob Becking, and we're going to come back to Bob Becking and quote from him at the end of the study today. He's got some pretty interesting things to say about verse 7. But Ackmeyer and others view verses 2 and 3 not as further descriptors of Nineveh's fall, but as an example of the bloody deeds of the Assyrian military, deeds for which the woe oracle of judgment has been pronounced. And she says here, quote, "This is one of the finest portrayals of a powerful nation to be found in literature. Here we see political, military, and economic power in all its devious corruption," end quote. And Spronk, he takes a different view. And speaking of the chariot, Spronk says, quote, "The root occurs only here and in Judges 5:22, in a passage suggesting military support from heaven. It can be regarded as another example of the poet deliberately associating the attackers of Nineveh with Yahweh and his heavenly host. The prophet Joel seems to have been inspired by this verse when he wrote about the day of Yahweh, end quote. I would also say it's possible that Nahum was inspired by Joel, depending on who wrote first. So scholars do debate, and there are quite a few scholars on each side of this issue as to whether verses 2 and 3 are describing the fall of Nineveh, which is obviously Sprunk's view, or if verses 2 and 3 are describing the brutality of the Assyrian military and are intended to be part of the accusation. And I personally prefer the view of Actmeyer, Jerome, Becking et al. Here. I think it makes more sense to view verse 2 and 3 as further evidence of Assyria's crimes, and these verses then being used as part of the indictment against her. I do suppose it's possible that both could be intended, as Nahum has employed vagueness throughout his prophecy to allow for multiple interpretations to be true. And Bruckner here says, quote, "Exposure of evil always requires a detailed description of what has been done, otherwise all is lost in abstraction. In 3 short verses, Nahum summarizes Nineveh's own offensive reputation. Blood, lies, plunder, victims, whips, wheels, horses, chariots, cavalry, swords, spears, casualties, dead bodies, corpses," end quote. So there Bruckner is on the side of Actmeyer and Becking and others, in that he's viewing verses 2 and 3 as describing Nineveh's military offensive prowess. In verse 4, Nahum chapter 3 verse 4 says, "Because of the many harlotries of the harlot, the charming one, the mistress of sorceries, who sells nations by her harlotries and families by her sorceries." And Roberts here says, quote, "Like an attractive, seductive prostitute, an accomplished sorceress who intoxicates and seduces her clients with her illicit love and black magic, Nineveh has intoxicated and seduced the nations," end quote. We also see here, this serves as a reminder of our own human tendency to be drawn in by the attractions of the world. So what did Nineveh offer? Sex, money, and power. And when you tie sorcery with drug use, as Revelation 9:21 makes clear, Nineveh and her goddess offered it all. And these same things are the same things that seduce and enslave humanity to this very day. So there really is nothing new under the sun. The same ways that Nineveh, that the Assyrians operated, the same things that they offered are the same things that still happen today. And scholars debate the meaning of the word translated sells in the phrase, quote, "who sells nations." And there is a lot of debate about this. One scholar suggests the translation should be "she that alienates nations." Others suggest that what's being described here is referring to a bargain or a barter, like they're trading nations. Another suggests a religious meaning, something like bringing the nations under the servitude of the goddess. And the medieval rabbis believed it was a metaphor, either for deceptive skill or for the disruptive influence of a harlot, in the sense that she would destroy the well-being of a family unit. And it is interesting that the prostitute is guilty of selling, and it says it's not just nations that she sells, but also families through her sorcery. That, let me get back up to it, but the verse says that she sells nations by her harlotries and families by her sorceries. And bodies and souls of men are listed among the cargoes sold by Mystery Babylon in Revelation 18:13. So this seems to literally be intended to be taken literally as true here. So the charming prostitute seduces and by her sorcery forces her will upon others. The Assyrians often boasted that they had the mightiest gods on their side, and their treaties often contained curses with supernatural sanctions if the treaties were violated. So Isaiah chapter 47 is a judgment on Babylon. But I'm going to read a few verses out of that chapter, and we'll note the similarities to Nahum's judgment on Nineveh. And then I'm also going to read a few verses from Revelation chapter 18, and we'll notice the similarities to the description of Mystery Babylon. So first, Isaiah's comments, and specifically what we're going for here is the idea of sorcery. So we'll notice specifically Isaiah's comments on Babylon's use of sorcery in Isaiah 47, verse 9, and then verse 12 and 13, which reads, "These two things will happen to you suddenly in one day, loss of children and widowhood. They will happen to you in their entirety, in spite of your many sorceries and the potency of your spells. So take your stand with your spells and your many sorceries, which you have wearied yourself with from your youth. Perhaps you will be able to succeed. Perhaps you will inspire terror. You are worn out with your many consultations, so let the astrologers stand and save you, those who observe the stars, those who predict monthly what will happen to you." So there Isaiah is mocking them. And as I mentioned, prostitution, evil trade, and sorcery are all descriptors of Mystery Babylon as well. And after John records the judgment of the great prostitute, we read in Revelation 18, 23, and 24, it says, "All this will happen because your merchants were the nobility of the earth, because all the nations were deceived by your sorcery. In her was found the blood of prophets and saints, and all of those slaughtered on the earth." So there we see the linkage from John with sorcery and bloodshed, which both have been mentioned in this taunt song, in this accusation against Nineveh. And the combination of prostitution and sorcery come together in the person of Jezebel. In 2 Kings 9:22, we read, when Joram saw Jehu, he asked, "Do you come in peace, Jehu?" He answered, "What peace can there be as long as there is so much prostitution and sorcery from your mother Jezebel?" And the word that Jehu uses for sorcery is the same word that's used here in Nahum. And that word is not used all that often in the Old Testament. It's, I think, less than 10 times it's used, if I remember correctly. So verse 5 and 6, "Behold, I am against you, declares Yahweh of hosts, and will lift up your skirts over your face, and I will make nations look at your nakedness and kingdoms at your shame. I will throw filth on you and treat you with contempt. I will make a spectacle of you." So the phrase, "I am against you," is a repetition of what we read in chapter 2, verse 13. And these are the words with which a champion challenged his opponent on the field of battle. So Yahweh is challenging the Assyrians, Nineveh, Ishtar, and Mystery Babylon, as I do, again, think all these things are linked together. And it's important to note also that the masculine forms in Hebrew have to be taken into account with the feminine image of the prostitute. So I'll say that again. The forms here in the Hebrew are in the masculine, yet the image of the prostitute is female throughout here. And so this could possibly point to the transgender characteristics of the goddess Ishtar, which we discussed previously as well. And in describing Yahweh of hosts, Christensen comments, quote, "The word hosts comes from the tradition of Yahweh's holy war in ancient Israel. A dimension of cosmic powers is attached to this word throughout its history," end quote. And Robertson here says, quote, "All 5 of the actions described above are attributed to the Lord himself, not some chosen servant," end quote. So Yahweh himself is personally involved, and he is the one revealing the truth behind Nineveh/Ishtar's glitter and glamour. He's showing the world what she really is, and he's reversing the total deceit with which they operate, with which they've deceived the nations, and he's bringing the truth out into the light. As we mentioned multiple times here throughout our study of Nahum, Assyria was famous for abusing and ridiculing those it conquered and captured. So once again, as we've seen throughout Nahum, the Lord is repaying Assyria in kind for how they treated others. Galatians 6 verse 7 says, "Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. And in the ancient Near East, prostitutes were punished by being stripped in public to expose them to shame and ridicule. So as Nineveh's treachery is laid out in terms of female prostitution, the punishment is rendered accordingly. And in the Septuagint, the word translated filth is the same word Jesus uses for the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24:15. This word is also used by the Septuagint translators 3 times in Daniel, and every time it's referring to the abomination of desolation. This word is also used of Mystery Babylon, the usage of this word serves as another linkage between Nineveh and Mystery Babylon. So Revelation 17, verse 1 and 2, and then 4 through 6 says, Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on the earth have become drunk. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup, and here we go, a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. So there it is again. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. So there we have the idea again of bloodshed being linked to all this. And it's the bloodshed of God's people. So again, this brings to mind the idea of the avenger of blood. And Mystery Babylon, the great prostitute, has filth or abomination, as again it's the same Greek word, and it's written on her forehead. So in the throughout the scriptures, filth is often, if not usually, related to the abominable pagan gods. So God throwing filth on Nineveh may contain the idea that he's throwing their abominable, filthy gods back at them. Nineveh has been judged in part for using supernatural powers that are hostile rivals of Yahweh, which again, that goes back to the idea of sorcery and their veneration of the gods Asher, Ishtar, and others. And worshiping false gods is an abomination to the one true God. And certain gods were even called, quote, the abomination in the Old Testament. Specifically, that phrase is used of Molech and Chemosh. Some scholars also point out that this word filth may carry the literal meaning of excrement. And the very end of the verse, we read, it says, I will make a spectacle of you. And interestingly, Rashi, the medieval Jewish teacher, Rabbi Rashi, interpreted this to mean excrement. So it's interesting that they view different parts of the verse as excrement. They see it in here, but they don't exactly agree as to exactly which part of the verse is referring to excrement. But Rashi's view has influenced a few modern scholars, but the majority go with the traditional rendering and link this last phrase of I will make a spectacle of you. They link that once again with how the Assyrian kings treated their victims. So how the Assyrian kings would make a spectacle of their prisoners, they are now the ones being made a spectacle of, as the Lord is paying them back once again in kind. And verse 7 says, Then all who see you will recoil from you, saying, Nineveh is devastated. Who will show sympathy to her? Where can I find anyone to comfort you? So Robertson here says, quote, So Nineveh's judgment is sure because of their sin. Their endless oppression of others sets a seal on their fate. All nations agree that their judgment is long overdue, end quote. Now, people used to flee from the oncoming Assyrian army, but now Nineveh's misery makes people seek to flee to get out of the way. And this is only the third time the name Nineveh has been used in Nahum. And Spronk notes that the name Nineveh here is in a purely negative context, indicating that nothing of the former name and fame shall be left. And Bob Becking has noted that the prophetic texts in Nahum that announce Nineveh's destruction all conclude with references to mourning rituals. And he argues for an allusion to a curse in the succession treaty of Esarhaddon, which reads, quote, "May your ghost have nobody to take care of the pouring of libations to him," end quote. So the spectator nations witness Nineveh's fall but offer no comfort. And the word for comfort is the name Nahum. So Nineveh will have no comforter, no Nahum. And Becking says this reference to no comforter is also a euphemism for mortuary existence in the netherworld. And other scholars believe the word is a technical term meaning performers of the funeral rites. So in other words, Nineveh will be abandoned in hell. No one will comfort her and no one will venerate her after death. And this is Nineveh's final mention in the book of Nahum. Nineveh is doomed. She will die with no mourners. And Nineveh, historically speaking, Nineveh almost literally disappeared from history for centuries. It wasn't rediscovered until, I believe it was the 1800s. But Xenophon, who was a Greek military leader, philosopher, and historian, he led the retreat of the Greeks over the site where Nineveh had once stood less than 300 years after Nahum's prophecy had been uttered, and he hardly seems to have suspected that the great city had ever been there. So in less than 300 years of Nahum's words, Nineveh had been swallowed up by the desert, to the extent that Xenophon, as he fled over the exact spot, didn't know that Nineveh had been there. Nineveh had been destroyed and forgotten, just as Nahum predicted. So this, verse 7, concludes the first taunt song of chapter 3. So we're going to stop here for today, and in our next study we will go through the second taunt song, which is verse 8 through 13. And in our final study we'll go through the last one, which is verse 14 through 19, as we close out the book of Nahum. So I want to thank everybody for listening, and I will see you guys next time as we continue working through Nahum. So thank you, everybody. God bless you all.